Well, in the belief that the best vantage point from which to observe the winds of change is the eye of the storm, I'm going to ask you to begin in the middle of our concerns. Raised in Arbutus, educated in parochial schools, a midshipman at the Naval Academy, an almost emblematic Baltimore area life, yet at a time when the tide started to flow outward, away from Center City, you evinced a commitment to downtown. That's what captured you. Why? Was that a conscious decision? Just one of the accidents of life? How did this concern grow and deepen? And can you reflect on this, both as a recollection from that period and as an examinatory view from the now, with the benefit of what we call perhaps 2020 hindsight?
How many hours do you want?
How many hours can you fill?
Actually, for reasons that are inexplicable, I have been wed to downtown since I was in the second grade. The reason for that, and I think it's instructive to speculate on, is when I was in the second grade, we moved from Highlandtown to Arbutus. And it was determined that my sister, Mildred, who's 6 years older than I am, was to take me to school. And she was a big girl. She was in the 8th grade at the Institute of Notre Dame at Asquith Street. And St. James School was just a block away. So I was hauled from Arbutus to St. James School every day, escorted by my sister, so I would not fall into trouble. Well, when you have an 8th grader who's interested in boys and a snot-nosed little brother who is not interested in boys, it becomes an inconvenience. And very early on, I was taught how to make it across town on my own. With the result that I soon discovered that there were many ways across town. For example, to get from Asquith and Eager Street, you can walk over a block or so and catch the 8 car, the old 8 trolley line downtown, and you can transfer at Fayette Street. Or you could stay on it and you could transfer at Gilmore Street. Or you could walk down the street the other way and catch the 19, and you could transfer at Baltimore Street. Or you could go out to Gilmore Street and transfer at Gilmore Street to the old Q bus line that ran out to Arbutus.
How long was this trip?
It generally the trip itself took about 40 minutes. However, the possibilities of the trip became very, very apparent because you had to go through downtown. Which meant my mother was a working woman. We were, in a sense, latchkey kids. But I very early figured it out that as long as I was home by 5 p.m., there were no consequences. With the result that from 2:40 in the afternoon until 5, I was free to explore. And I was able to explore downtown Baltimore from the eyes of a 7-year-old. And for whatever reason, everything I have ever done has led me back to downtown Baltimore. Every job. And is that a consequence of what I want? Or is it fate? I don't know. Now, someplace along the line, our destinies got tied up.
When you got out of the Navy and you started working your first real job for BG&E?
Well, actually, my first job, I was a student at Western Maryland College, and I got a job with Dun & Bradstreet, who at that time had their largest office outside of New York here in Baltimore, because Baltimore was a big clothing jobbing center in those days. And guess what? My first territory was the old postal zones 1 and 2. That was my territory, where I got to know a huge number of people. 2 years later, when I graduate from school and go to work for Baltimore Gas and Electric, guess what? As a commercial rep, dealing with our commercial accounts, my first territory is postal zones 1 and 2. With the result, there was a time when I could go up street after street and tell you store after store and the names of people. Frequently, I knew how many grandchildren they had. I knew where they had emigrated from. I can't do that anymore, but I can try.
Now, this was in the mid-50s.
This is 1956, yeah.
56.
1956.
And you were at the gas company, the BG&E.
That's a commercial representative, right?
And you worked there until 1980.
I was there till, January 1982.
And it was during a time in the mid-50s that downtown really started to change. That's where the flow, or when the flow started going outward.
Absolutely. Actually, it was probably taking place in very, very quiet ways before that. But I think the seminal event of the change in downtown was probably 1956, 1957. And this is the point at which the great project in Woodlawn is completed. When Social Security is moved out of downtown en masse to Woodlawn, which left a huge emptiness in downtown as far as office space was concerned. For example, I know Social Security occupied a huge portion of the Cantor building. There were buildings on Calvert Street that they occupied in very large portion. All of that was moved out. We're talking several hundreds of thousands of square feet of office space that was emptied at the flick of a switch.
And of course, this impacted upon a lot of satellite businesses.
This impacts everything. When you pull, I don't know what the number was, 20,000, 15,000 jobs out of downtown Baltimore, like that. There is an impact. There's an impact on lunch stands. There's an impact on newsstands. There's an impact on retail trade. When 10,000 pairs of pantyhose a day move out, well, there's an effect on the hosiery business. Something to that effect. So there was that vacuum, and it is interesting that it's from that period, and that you have emerging the Greater Baltimore Committee and the planning that leads to Charles Center, the greats like Jeff Miller and Walter Sondheim, even, who was a much younger man then, but who started this whole process of let us take a look at this, and leads directly to the Charles Center Inner Harbor project, and that I believe, however, that the Social Security move is the seminal event. Now, things were happening before that, obviously, but the actual event is the trigger.
That was a tipping point.
That was a tipping point, absolutely. And then other things began to show themselves.
Wasn't that about the same time McCormicks started developing Hunt Valley? I know they still have.
No, McCormicks is a little bit later. McCormicks is probably, well, it might have been in their head, because I guess, let's see, the Hunt Valley Inn comes in about 1963, 64, comes on the scene. So obviously they were well along. So it could very well be that McCormicks was into that, but I don't know that for I never really connected it, but it's a good idea. But however, there are some other tips in here. That things were not what they should have been, or they were not, well, as we would have them. For example, in January 1955, we had our first department store closing downtown.
Which one was that?
Thomas O'Neill at Lexington and Charles Street. That was the first of the department stores to disappear. Now, are they things connected? I don't know. That was a problem of landlord and tenant. There were 5 buildings there. They were owned by the Chittard, an old family who they came to Baltimore in 1798. But there were 5 people who owned 5 different buildings, and they couldn't agree. And O'Neill said, the ONeills organization said, "No, that's it. We're out of here." But that was a loss to Charles Street because O'Neill's was the anchor at the south end of the Charles Street that is much lauded in fiction and song, so to speak. But that was a significant turn of events.
Did that start the exodus of the major Howard Street in downtown stores, Hochschild's, Hecht's, Hutzler's,
No, I can't.
Stewart's?
I couldn't make that connection, but there probably is a connection, but I can't make it. You have the Howard Street thing. The Howard Street thing is probably starts even earlier than that, because it's I believe our first satellite department store was Hochschild Cohn's at the what used to be Edmondson Village. And that was a landmark event. I mean, it was a national event. I guess Joe Meyerhoff had something to do with that. He was lauded. This first post-war real shopping center. And Hochschild's right smack in the center of it. And he apparently achieved extraordinary success. And they quickly followed it by another store at Belvedere and York Road, which became a success instantly. Well, you might look at that as the beginning of the erosion of Howard Street, because ultimately they all went that way over the next number of years, building their suburban stores. They still held a place down here, but it was very clearly a downhill road. Probably produced by, first, the convenience of the suburban stores, secondly, by the proliferation of the motor car as the primary means of transportation, and third, by the fact that people had moved were becoming suburbanized.
A national trend.
The national trend, that's right. But, however, contributing to that is also the removal of jobs, a la the Social Security thing. The movement of large numbers of retail customers, day-to-day retail customers. The customer who spends $1.98 a day. That's significant to the retail, to the dealer.
Now, at that time, when you were the commercial rep for BG&E, were you consciously aware of this, or was it a kind of slow erosion, or was it something that you could feel at the time? Hey, it's going.
Okay. I was a young man, and I was trying to make a rep for myself. And I have to say, yes, I was conscious of it. But I became conscious of it because the second floors were empty. In my youth, there were always occupants on second floors of stores. It might be Joe's Detective Agency. It might be Pearl's Podiatrist. All sorts of things. It might be Amy Sue's lampshade repair shop. But the second floors were occupied. Now, when I took over my territory, we had a very, very elaborate method for managing territory. Today you could do it on a little Palm Pilot, but this was a huge amount of cards and what have you. In my files, as I inherited them, the second floors were empty. And this was an indicator. Now, I didn't know what that indicated. I was only 26, 27 years old, just starting out. But I knew it indicated something. And I used to talk about it, but I didn't know what I was talking about. But it was there. It was there to be seen. I just didn't know what it meant.
That impacted, of course, on also ripples in the stream and all of the side businesses and so forth. Were you conscious of a civic commitment on your part in terms of wanting to stem the tide, or what?
No, that comes later.
How did that come about?
Well, came about by an interesting comment by a realtor in 1960. Well, I guess it was late 64, early 65. And it came about when the first African American moved into the Midwood area of Govans.
Now, you were living in Govans.
My family was there. I had a family of 5 children, my wife. And we had a house on Benning House Road. And we considered doing what the rest of the world was doing, moving. And we looked around, found a house, found a nice house. And then took a look at selling our present house. And a man came over, a realtor of some sort, I don't remember the company, and he says, "You're doing the right thing because they are coming." Well, for reasons I have yet to understand, that was a bad thing to say. It's at this point that it sort of got under my skin. And I've never thought of myself as being a great social reformer, but it got under my skin that they are coming. And to the chagrin of many of the people I love, I walked away from it. Now, that's the beginning. That comment. That somehow there was something wrong.
Skin being the appropriate metaphor there.
The what?
Skin being the appropriate metaphor there.
Fair enough. But that somehow there was something wrong with doing that. So we stayed there. And one could not stay there without becoming civically energized. Either that or the waves were going to sweep over us. You could not stay there without reacting to or being proactive to conditions around you. And then things went on from there. God help me.
Is that what projected eventually your interest in the City Fair?
Well, there are a couple of events in here. In just about this time, about 65. Remember Gino Marchetti? Gino Marchetti, the great end for the Colts. Well, he had also a successful business.
And he started those hamburger stands.
He and Alan Amici, they went into the hamburger business. And they wanted to open a shop there on York Road, right at the old car loop. There's a steakhouse there now.
Well, it became the Rustler or something.
Yeah, it became the Rustler. Now it's something else. But under any circumstance, but they wanted to open a hamburger joint. And our Improvement Association had gotten its ire up and said, well, this is going to generate a lot of trash. It's going to generate an enormous amount of kid traffic. we'll have a drive-in and cars will be coming and going and blah, blah, blah. So they opposed the zoning. It is interesting that someplace in a late 60s Sports Illustrated, I no longer remember which copy, that there was a comment that Gino Marchetti would much rather deal with the Chicago Bears line than the housewives of Govans, because we gave him a hard time. But anyway, that produced a surge of organization and the founding of the Community Council of Govans, which was kind of a loose umbrella group of neighborhood association. But it did produce a lot of interest, a lot of activity. And I got drawn into it. I got drawn into it through perhaps the smartest person I've ever known, Madeline Cooper. The late Madeline Cooper, who I dearly loved, admired, respected, and was a dear, dear counselor to me for many, many years. But at any rate, she sort of sucked me in. And I had some, shall we say, minor talents that were of some use. And I got into this thing. Well, we finally beat Gino's. And this had to do, we had formed an alliance with the, I think it was the Greater Northwood Association. A guy by the name of Paul Langmuir, something like that. And his wife were headed that. And we decided that, gee, if we could do this, we ought to have some kind of stability. And what we really needed is we needed a sort of a headquarters. And we needed somebody who would sort of do the paperwork for us. And we went to the Archdiocese of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese, what was then the Urban Commission, a guy by the name of Frank Bean. And we said, look, why don't you guys put up 15 grand a year for the first 2 years? And this will fund a secretary and an office. And we will communicate. This will be our communications headquarters. And we'll stay on top of things. And we'll be able to deal with matters like this. Well, everybody's building empires. And he went into the innards there. And someone arrived at the conclusion that, gee, this wasn't the solution to this problem. What we needed was an activist umbrella group. Well, we weren't quite sure what that meant. But nevertheless, the Roman Catholic officials went to work. And pretty soon they bring a fellow to Baltimore, incidentally a wonderful priest, a man who I respect highly, but a guy by the name of Jack Egan. And Jack Egan's a very important man. And who comes in, he spends half a day here and says, you're right, you need an umbrella group. And recommended the formation of an Alinsky-style community organization.
Just to clarify that for people who may not be familiar, you're referring to Saul Alinsky.
I'm going to refer to Saul
the
Alinsky.
great neighborhood organizer and professional rabble-rouser from Chicago.
That's right. But at this point, we thought Saul Alinsky was a Jewish tailor. Most of us had never heard of him. And we didn't know what this meant. And it took us some time to really track it down. And I do remember someplace on the shelf here, there's a copy of his book written in 1948, Reveille for Radicals, which he then reworked and came out with Rules for Radicals 22, 23 years later, which I also have. But at any rate, but we didn't know what that meant. And the next thing we know, we have a cadre. Well, the Archdiocese has made commitments. They have leaned on other religious groups. And they've come up with $100,000 a year to underwrite this operation for 2 or 3 years. And the next thing we know, we have a fellow by the name of Harry Brunette, who was an ex-Episcopal priest, or maybe he was still an Episcopal priest, but he was playing this game, who is now the lead organizer. And we have all sorts of activity taking place from 25th Street to Giddings Avenue, and from Paring Parkway to, I guess, York Road. Maybe it went to not York Road, Bologna Avenue. Well, that's a huge area. And it's a lot further than 3 miles from 25th Street to the city line.
Now, this time frame is the mid-'60s.
By this time we're in 1968. We're in 1968. And all of this activity and rap, but we don't know what it means, except there was one significant thing that we learned was significant, was a characteristic of a Linsky organization, was that existing leadership must be removed. Apparently, according to Linsky principles, the existing leadership is all bad. Whether it's good or bad or not, it's all bad. It has to be removed. We need new leaders. And there was intense activity taking place. I mean, neighbor turning on neighbor. There were fights. There were divorces. This thing was traumatic to the whole area. And you became known. You were either a necktie or you weren't. That was our nickname, necktie. They had a tendency to turn red in the face. But, and we had to learn a whole new lexicon, whole new body of behavior. And I became part of, we'll call it the resistance movement. And it was a group. Certainly Madam was the leader. I was there. Madeline Cooper. I was there. A writer by the name of Bernie Curtis, his lovely wife. One of the Knotts, Frank Knott, and his wife. There were probably about 24 of us who formed the resistance movement. And we had to learn how to do a great deal with very little. And we had a lot of fun doing it. And Madeline, incidentally, is a little funny story. She ran a little catering operation. She was very well known around Roland Park and Guilford for doing small parties. And her pinafores and all this other fancy stuff were famous. And there was many a night where I'm convinced Madeline was as much into community activity for the free help as she was. Because we would sit there chopping peppers and we're talking. What does this mean? And somebody would be reading. Now, what does that mean and how does that relate to what just happened? As we taught ourselves the principles of community organizing a la Alinsky, we'll say 1948. And I'm happy to say we beat the bastards. But we had a good time. We learned a great deal. Now, that's a long way around to getting to your answer to the question, does this lead to the City Fair? City Fair was an event that took about 2 years to develop in concept, as near as I know, to the best of my knowledge. And it involved what can we do to rally the city around something? And when I say 2 years, we had the riots after the Martin Luther King assassination. And April '68, I guess. And the city was down at the mouth. There was it seemed to be an accelerating white flight, middle-class white flight.
And those riots really devastated central Baltimore.
Well, the riots certainly, well, actually, when you say central Baltimore, I'm not so sure you're right there, Richard. I think they devastated the African-American central Baltimore. Mm-hmm. They worked Pennsylvania Avenue terribly bad. They worked Monument Street very badly. They really didn't hit the business district, which is one of those, which has never been quite explained to me by sociologists or anybody else. Why it went that way? Why do you hit these people? Why not there? But that's another question that I can't answer.
Well, that was kind of parallel in New York. It hit Harlem and Bed-Stuy.
Yeah, you destroyed home territory. That's but, and it's never been fully explained why. There are explanations, but no one has been successfully explained it to me. At any rate, nevertheless, the idea was, how do we come up with a rallying point? Well, there wasn't much for us to rally around. Now, there's another phenomenon that's taking place here simultaneously. We had a young, vigorous mayor who all but abdicated.
You're referring to
Tommy D'Alessandro III. Tommy was a fine man, imbued with what I'll call the popular liberalism of the 60s. And it didn't work. His city went into a state of chaos for a time. And from where I sat, he all but abdicated and turned the running of the city over to the then president of the city council, William Donald Schaefer. Let us cut right here so I can get a drink of water. Sure. Please. Now, it's at this point where we get one of those, I'm going to call it serendipitous events, where there is a gathering of eagles, so to speak. In the sense, here in the late 1968, 69, 70, William Donald Schaefer, for whatever reason, was able to gather about him a body of people who, at the least, were very, very bright, and at their best were downright brilliant, who, for whatever reason, found themselves dedicated to the city of Baltimore. Now, I talk of people, Sandy Hillman, Bob Embry, Charlie Benton, Marion Pines, Joan Bereska, and a very long list of people who, to a great extent, weren't much more than paid volunteers, paid mere pittances. You had Hope Quackenbush. He had, somehow or other, he had energized the interest of newspaper editors. I remember Lou Lindley from the city editor for the News American, going absolutely ecstatic, almost orgasmic over things that were taking place. Now, I personally am convinced that we all got caught up in this. Well, no, I know personally I got caught up in it. And I believe the influence was, strangely enough, the Kennedy inauguration speech, the Ask Not speech, that we had a city that was down at the mouth, and it appeared there wasn't going to be anybody else around to change anything. Therefore, we somehow had to do this. That's my personal conviction. That's also my personal faith, that somehow or other, that's what happened.
And this had been after years of outflow, especially following that tipping point of the Social Security exodus.
Yeah, but I think we were more concerned with the acute present conditions. I don't think any of that occurred to any of us. I don't think any of that background really. That comes with retrospection, much, much later. What happened? I don't think we were. I'm not sure we were analytical in this. Now, so someplace in the minds of, and it actually was Sandy Hillman and an architect, Bo Kelly, and Hope Quackenbush, probably Bob Embry. There occurred this thinking somewhere in the late '68. What can we do? We need an event. We need an event to energize the city, to rally the city. And they started sort of trying to pound out some kind of event, but they couldn't find anything that seemed to work, that they thought they could make work. The original concept of the City Fair, as I understood it, I was not part of this, was the idea of having on the same day events in the squares of Baltimore. But they couldn't solve the transportation problem, and then became sort of convinced that it really wouldn't work, that you weren't going to get people to, at this point, to travel deep into African American neighborhoods. Although I guess we didn't use African American, we were using black neighborhoods. But nevertheless, they pounded away at it. And sometime in the spring of 70, February or March, a guy by the name of Chris Hartman, who was a newspaper reporter for the News American, came out and made a pitch to the Community Council of Govans about participating in something called a city fair. And like everyone else, we said, what the hell is a city fair? And that it was going to be concentrated on the neighborhoods of Baltimore. Well, I was the Community Council of Govans was not part of NECO. We were actually very contrary to it, and I saw this as being a proactive defensive mood.
And then finally, Chris Hartman started to convince you in the Govans organization.
Well, he became
activists.
He became the. I guess Chris played the role of executive director that year. Hope Quackenbush was the chairman, and she was working at the HCD. We had a huge amount of help out of HCD. We had a huge amount of help out of CPHA. In terms of people. Gee, I just noticed Joanne Copes was in housing, and Joanne Copes was secretary at CPHA at this period, and was very, very active and is a dear friend. But the thing about it is no one, even including the planners, I believe, knew what they were getting themselves into.
Well, what convinced you that the city fair was a good idea if you
Well,
resisted to it?
I didn't know whether it was a good idea or not, except it was a defensive move that if we were claiming what's the international term? Hegemony over Govans. And I advocated for it so that we could block out Nickel. That was my motivation.
So it was really a political maneuver.
It was a political movement to block out this organization that we knew from our readings would not go programmatic. According to everything Alinsky and the Industrial Areas Foundation taught, these organizations never went programmatic. And this was in the realm of program. And that was my motivation for taking over the chair for the greater Community Council of Govans. And it was a blocking device. Now, that maneuver changed my life.
How so?
Because now I'm no longer just a neighborhood activist. Now I'm getting caught up in the whole city. Now, this is after the summer of 1970, I am so caught up in this city as a wonderful place, in my curiosity about the city.
But your working life at that time was still
I'm still at the gas company. Oh yeah, I'm still making a living.
Downtown Baltimore.
But Baltimore is taking on a greater and greater importance to me. And going back to my friend in 1964, they will not run me out of town, whoever they are. So you take a mixture of a little Irish stubbornness, a little stupidity, and you wind up with a zealot.
This must have been taking a toll on personal and family life.
Suffice it to say yes. Suffice it to say yes. There's no need to go there. Well, anyway. And by the 1st of October, 1970, I'm caught up in the whole thing. Never. My whole life has changed. Baltimore, for whatever reason, becomes the central motivating force in my life. For better or for worse. And that's where it's been these last, 32, 33 years.
Is that what got you into to take over the directorship of the City Fair?
Yeah, absolutely. To want it. It led to practically all of the good things that have happened to me. Certainly led to some of the bad things that have happened to me.
Well, what made it successful? I mean, what made the City Fair really happen? As I said, visitors from where I used to live would come to attend the Baltimore City Fair. Everybody thought it was a wonderful event. What was the core of that success that tied the city together?
Arguably, but this is my opinion. The first thing is the people who organized it. We were able, for a period of years, 10, 12 years, to enlist the damnedest array of talent to put this thing together you ever saw in your life. I believe a good portion of that had to do with the fact that we were able to supply this talent with toys they had never been able to play with before in their lives. You take, I think of one example of an accounting type who got to be out there with a crane, running a 30-ton crane. who wandered about, was able to be dirty for 4 days as we put this event on, and he made himself available 36 hours a day during this period, where four-letter words didn't violate anybody's. Actually, I think that's all the language consisted of, were four-letter words during this period, where you were expected to achieve incredible feats with nothing. That is very, very few resources. Some hand tools. You had a team of people.
Where'd the funding come from?
Where the what?
The funding come from to get it started.
Oh, well, excuse me, I have an overactive epiglottis or whatever the hell you call it, Anthony. Generally, we raised the money from businesses. That was a major task. It was a major task of the director to raise the money. And typically, the fair, well, its peak years by 73, 74, probably had a budget of $800,000 to $1 million. That came from ticket sales and contributions, in-kind services from the city, and whatever else you could beg, borrow, or steal. We never really made any money. I think maybe we showed profit over the 21 years, maybe 4 years. Showed a surplus, which we used the following years because now we can go bigger. But at the heart of the thing, when we started it, there were actually only 12, I'll use the term authentic neighborhoods that participated. The fair figures say 19. 7 of those 19 were, we call them ersatz neighborhoods, things created by HCD to participate under one or another of government programs, but they weren't really neighborhoods. Now, 12 neighborhoods isn't much, but we had a hell of a good time. And those 12 neighborhoods they produced a synergistic, and I'm not really a great one on that word, but a synergistic effect that somehow transmitted itself to people who came. And these were the bright lights in the city. This is what we had to sell. And it was Windsor Hills and Govans and Northwoods and Union Square and what's the name? Georgine Edgerton's organization out in Walbrook, and Dr. and Naomi Camper's garden club, and these were the gems that were active. This is what consisted of Baltimore pretty much of old. And that's what we were elevating.
How'd you manage to get BG&E to kind of put you on loan for such an extended period?
Well, that was in 72. I had a funny job at BG&E. I had a job that no one was ever able to describe in terms of when it came to job description. No one was ever able to describe my job because I did a lot of funny things. And subsequently, Bernie True became chairman and said, I let you go, but you always march to your own damn drummer. And he said, I never knew exactly what you were doing, but it seemed to turn out all right. So we went along with it. That's why I let you get away with this stuff, because I was irregular, let's put it that way. But the company certainly in those days, BG&E was very conscious of its position in the community. It was of the community. I mean, you had a rule. The object of the employment role was to employ as many families or representatives of as many families as possible. Therefore, if you were my brother, you couldn't come to work for BG&E if I worked there. One of us had to go. And it was probably a pretty sound set of policies. It gave maximum coverage. That is, everybody knew somebody who worked there. And that was important to them. And our officers were of Baltimore. They weren't like these companies we have today, where these hired guns come in from East Upchuck at $700 million to run a company. These were men who probably graduated from Poly, 8 course. They were of Baltimore. They were proud of their product. They knew that the town had to prosper. And with the result that that was relatively easy. And actually, at the time, C. Edward Uttermole was the chairman, and he readily made me available. I think they might have made me available to get me out of the circuit for 6 months or a year, but not really. But the other side of it is it was also expected you would succeed. That is, it wasn't a case of go out there and, do the window dressing posture. You were expected to succeed. And you were expected to report back that you succeeded. And somebody else better report that you succeeded. I wasn't surplus wood. I was supposed to accomplish something. There's someplace around here I've got a letter I wrote on that subject, but one took it seriously.
And part of that was success of the City Fair.
I suppose. Yeah. I suppose.
You suggested in an interview done 30 years ago that a lot of the other events, like the Fells Point Neighborhood Festival and so forth, spun off from the City Fair.
No. Fells Point Festival, Fells Point Festival was 2 years older.
Oh, so that fed into it.
It suggested the possibility. There were certainly things we studied about the Fells Point Festival. But it was 2 years older. It started, when we were 70, it started in 68. It might have been 3 years, 67. Quite a different kind of event. Because down here in Fells Point, we were into alternative lifestyle at that point. And it was alternative. But, and it was a one-day event. It was Sunday afternoon, as I recall. The first 2 or 3 were just single days. But it was an indication that there was a life. Now, the ethnic festival, there had been ethnic festivals around town for many, many years. They were worth studying. They were fairly well confined and not huge mass things, certainly nothing like the City Fair, and not what the ethnic festivals became once we get to about 1974, 75. They became very large also. But the City Fair was unique. It tried to learn some lessons. We had to learn quite a bit about crowd control. Actually, knew nothing. People who put on the City Fair had no qualification to put the City Fair on.
Why did it dwindle away, do you think? It seemed to me that after it moved under the Jones Falls Expressway that year, that seemed to be the knell.
Well, okay. The The two I don't believe are really related, but let's get the Jones Falls Expressway out of the way. The City Fair went under the Jones Falls Expressway because I wanted it there.
Did you? Why did you want it there? It closed?
No, well, there were several problems we confronted. Wiring up that fairground electrically for 3 days was going to the point of being absolutely prohibitive. It was costing us $300,000, $400,000 a year just to wire it up. Secondly, by its very nature being moved around year after year, there were enormous costs we had to encounter every year, one-time costs that were becoming prohibitive. If I move from this site to that site, things change. I need other stuff.
Right.
Now, in I had it in 85. That was my year as chairman. And I took that job only on the condition that I would be allowed to put it under expressway. And my rationale was, we'll wire it up hard once. We have some protection against weather. And we can decorate it so that it is a festive place. Well, that's sort of like the objectives of Iraq. They're good objectives. But as it turns out, I sort of ran out of money to decorate it. However, it still worked. And it probably would have worked if we hadn't gotten that stupid administration that followed William Donald, whose ability to imagine was somewhere around zero, and who also incidentally wanted to do away with Schaefer-inspired operations. But that isn't the reason the fair failed. I think the fair came to an end because we lost. We lost the ability to attract the kind of talent volunteer talent that we had been able to attract all those many years. When you get into the mid-'80s, we're now into another world. We're in the heart of the Reagan years.
Go.
Go for get. For get. Fine. I'll take. Let's see. Here's a guy. He was chairman one year. Tom Mobley. He runs McCormicks Place in Chicago. Well, for 8 or 9 years, we had Tom Mobley as a volunteer. There is no way on earth I could attract that kind of talent who would give me anywhere from 200 to 1,000 hours a year of volunteer help today. No way on earth. And that was the lifeblood of the city fair. Now, that kind of talent, by 85, it wasn't there. Now, by virtue of my own position, I was able to pull a lot of people out of semi-retirement, sort of lean on them, bend their arms, and get it out of them. But that was, with respect to the city fair, that was probably my biggest mistake. I should not have taken the chairmanship. It should have ended then. Because after that, it peters out. And certainly you didn't get the help and the in-kind services that you got from the city. But it peters out after that, and that was probably the dumbest thing I ever did. However, in all fairness to the rest of the world, it was my fault because I had an ego trip on that. I did. I wanted to make it work.
But by this time you had already started to focus in on the harbor and stuff.
Oh, I'm already into the harbor. I'm into the harbor 10 years. I'm into the harbor 15 years by that point.
Had that started with the paddle boats?
Yeah, well, that all started in 1975. We opened up on July 4th, 1975. Uh, but let's take a break.
You are back on.
Well, during these years, and you're working for BG&E, you're involved with the City Fair, you've been involved in the Govins Community Center, Govins Project. What got you down to the harbor?
That was a city fair. You see, in '72, when I was executive director, it was my honor and pleasure to sort of open the harbor up with the city fair. That is, while there had been pieces of the fair down there, in '72 we put most of it down there. And we had the neighborhood tents and institutional and the main stage and a lot of stuff like that. But now, one of the things that I just did, I became an impresario, and I put on a water ski show in '72. Now, a water ski show in 1972 in Baltimore's harbor was absolutely absurd. They thought we were stark raving mad. And a lovely group from up northeast Maryland, I guess it was the Northeast Ski Club, did this for us. Well, on that Sunday afternoon, which would be, it was October 1, 1972, that Sunday afternoon, we had the damnedest traffic jam in the harbor. It was a beautiful golden autumn afternoon. But the damnedest boat traffic jam in the harbor you ever saw in your life. And I looked at it and I said, go to hell. And by the middle of November, I had a proposal into Charles Center in the harbor to put up a boat rental facility in the, actually sailboats. Actually, it was not sailboats, catamarans. Well, sailboats. And that 1 hour, 2 hour period on that Sunday afternoon was a sort of, again, seminal in terms of my life. Well, it took another 2 or 3 years for things to sort themselves out. Because when we built the fair, what we built for the fair in the harbor that weekend, we moved in immediately behind the contractors who were moving out, who had just finished the seawall. We were the first event there, and had the North Shore there, where the World Trade Center is, around to, I guess it's Conway Street. But our that was our property area, and it was the first thing to take place in the renewed harbor. And I was privileged to be able to see these possibilities. And that led to ultimately the dock, where most famous for the paddle boats, which were unceremoniously ripped out of my hands by the Schmoke administration. But at any rate, and the sailboats, and then sort of as an afterthought, which the water taxis are, it led to the water taxis.
What made you start thinking about paddle boats there?
I needed to make some money. It's easier to rent paddle boats than it is sailboats. Sailboats are wonderful. I love sailing. My kids love sailing. We had a lot of fun sailing, but we couldn't make any money sailing. And you got to pay the bills. And I was in no way, shape, or form able to engage in this well, I wasn't a rich man. I couldn't afford this hobby.
Yeah, the old joke about a boat being a hole in the water into which you pour money.
But the paddle boats paid the bills. And the object of the activity was to make the harbor more attractive to more people. And a hell of a lot more people can operate a paddle boat than you can a sailboat.
Absolutely. Paddle boats take off right away? Were they an instant?
Pretty much.
Success?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We, There was never any problem there.
Did the paddle boats lead to the water taxi? And not a straight line.
The fact that we were there is what led to it. That's a funny story. William Donald Schaefer was perhaps one of the most accessible mayors the city's ever had. Now, and he was easy to track, and particularly if you were friends with people on his staff. Well, he had a driver, Chuck Knowles, who was a neat guy, and occasionally I had to see William Donald. He'd call Chuck up and say, "Where is he going to be tomorrow morning?" And he would say, "Well, gee, he's going to do his harbor walkthrough tomorrow." "Okay, what time?" 6:30. I said, "Okay." And you'd go down and stand behind a potted palm down and come out and walk up the promenade with him. One of those Tuesdays, it was what, 1976. He says, "Ed, I want a boat that goes from here to there." I said, "Why? There ain't nothing here and ain't nothing there." He says, "But there will be." And he said, "Give me a boat that runs back and forth." And that was basically from the amphitheater at now Harbor Place down to the amphitheater at where the Science Center would be. Neither was there. And I allowed his house. It was going to cost some money. He said, "Well, I'll give you a extension on your lease." So I agreed to do something that, well, a boat. We didn't even call it a water taxi at that point.
Now this was in 70...
This is late, spring of 76. And we fooled with it, and it took a while. But I finally found a boat that I could afford. It was cheap enough that I could afford to lose money on if I had to, which I did for some time. And we started the water taxi in 77.
Just that one straight line.
Yeah, more or less irregularly. Sometimes it ran, sometimes it didn't. It was interesting. I was imbued with a desire to be environmentally sensitive. And my first boat, which was Fair City 1, was a little pontoon boat, 21 passengers, had a little plastic roof on it, and was powered with two 3-horsepower electric motors. With a very, very bad control system. The control system would burn up with some degree of frequency because it was all electromechanical relays. And they would stick, and there'd be a loose connection so the battery cables would heat up. But it wasn't terribly important because there wasn't anybody rushing. It isn't like we were moving people any place because there wasn't any place to go. And we fooled with it. And all of it. Actually, I still have those 2 motors someplace.
So it was just a boat ride to the passenger.
Yeah, it was 25 cents. And, but, the thing of it is, it was a boat ride to nowhere that didn't cost much and didn't lose much. And sometimes it ran, sometimes it didn't. Nobody seemed to care. And we fooled with it for, 77 through 80. We really didn't go at it seriously until 81. And in 81, the event, well, 2 things were happening. One, the city finally got around to building some decent landings for us. And 2, the aquarium opens in August of 81. And that's the cornerstone. The aquarium at Harbor, the aquarium is the cornerstone of the development of our harbor, not Harbor Place.
Really?
Yes. I'm going to get in trouble on that, but it's okay.
You know, everybody thinks in terms of Harbor Place is what happened, almost as if the aquarium was an adjunct to Harbor Place.
Yeah.
Which is a conventional attitude.
Well, it was there first, but it's not the key to the success. It's not the key to success because I couldn't convince you to come down here from some god-awful place in mid Pennsylvania to go to Harbor Place. To go to a shopping center.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of good shopping centers in between. If we take a look at what I'll call, and Harbor Place is an example of what was called festival hall shopping. And it's a concept developed by the Riots Company, a brilliant concept. And it seems to work very well at Faneuil Hall in Boston, which is the founding site of this kind of idea. But it never was really that successful. It was successful in Boston. It was successful in Baltimore. And virtually every place else, festival hall shopping at best is mediocre in terms of success. Because it very rapidly becomes the same. If I've got a festival hall in Baltimore, it's sort of the same as the one that's in Toledo, Ohio, or Norfolk, Virginia, or Miami. They're essentially the same. And by virtue of that proclivity of large organizations to go to efficiency, so you got the Cordovan Leather Company in Baltimore say, we'll make a deal with you, but you got to put one in each of the others.
Right.
With the result, they very, very rapidly become the same. Now, why in hell do I want to travel 600 miles to go see the same thing? No, the key to Baltimore, no, hold it. Let me back off on that. Harbor Place was important. It was important because it was a step forward. But it's not the key to the success of the harbor. And one of the fascinating things about Harbor Place was that the first 2.5 years was indeed built on Baltimoreans. And it was built on Baltimoreans because of something else we talked about, which had to do with the fact that for 10 years, we had been building a constituency for the harbor via City Fair and a whole range of other activities, wherein people were being dragged to the harbor for various reasons, mainly the ethnic festivals, the City Fair. We had Op Sale in there, Op Sale 76, which was a huge success. We had built the constituency so that people were curious. And for the first 2.5 seasons, almost, it was Baltimoreans who made Harbor Place a success. The bars and restaurants became meccas for Baltimoreans.
Not out-of-town tourists.
Not out-of-towners. They weren't here yet. They don't appear until really 1982. That's when they begin appearing. And that makes sense. You do not build a tourist attraction overnight. This was built over a period of years. You must convince the industry to come to your town. You must tell them. And it's with the, excuse me, get the goddamn epic glass.
You want to break again?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll be okay.
Okay, we're starting up again.
Okay, so you're talking about the aquarium really being the draw. The out-of-towners and the aquarium really opening in 81, and the out-of-towners starting to appear in 82. And it was the aquarium that was a key to the tourism draw.
Oh, the aquarium is the sine qua non of our whole tourism trade. It is the unique element, and one of the interesting things about the aquarium, and I hate to say this, but it is truly the only international destination success we have ever had in the harbor, if you ignore the ballparks.
Well, we all remember Don Schaefer in his 1900s bathing suit and straw hat being in Time magazine.
But it is the central element, without which nothing. And they, thank God, have been very conscious of their importance and their role, and have worked very hard at it, at keeping it as a primary attraction to the harbor for the purpose of, well, their own purposes, but to the benefit of the rest of us who are in this new field to Baltimore called tourism. Because one of the things that's important, certainly to the city, is the fact that tourism in Baltimore is the only industry the city has invented since World War II that works.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow or other, it seems to get ignored with some degree of frequency as being of no importance. Yet, at this time, we probably have somewhere between 28 and 40,000 people who depend on tourism as a source of their livelihood. And
you think this radiates out through the health of the city?
oh, absolutely. Look, if we'll go back to 72. Let's use 72 as an index year. In 1972, if you wanted a good restaurant downtown, you had Teal Pepe's, you had, I forgot the name of it, the seafood restaurant down there on Baltimore Street, Hausner's.
Well, Houser's East Baltimore.
Right, but nevertheless, in the Baltimore.
Danny's and the Prime Rib, I guess.
Danny's, the Prime Rib, Marconi's, maybe a couple of others. You could fill up. You would just barely fill two hands. Today, you can come up with 2 dozen. Does tourism radiate out? Obviously it does, with all of the staff and everything. In 1972, you had what was then the Hilton and is now, I don't know, they keep changing names over again. But nevertheless, it was the Hilton and the Lord Baltimore Hotel. Yeah, that was it. Belvedere, I guess, was there too. Then we were hotels. Does tourism radiate out? You bet your sweet bippy. And that has to be kept going.
I know that Phillips opened their Harbor Place restaurant in 1980, and now it's one of the leading grossing seafood restaurants in the country.
Yeah, Phillips was
And
a
it took
success from the
long
beginning.
time
They were
it really took a long time to build along with.
Well, we've had to learn, and we're still learning. We've had to learn the skills for being a tourist town. We didn't have the skills. We didn't have the people. We didn't have the services. We didn't know what the hell we were doing.
Well, what got you expanding the water taxi along with that? Was the aquarium an impetus on expanding the water taxi too?
Oh, yeah, Fells Point. Fells Point. If you're going to run a transportation service and expect to make money, you got to transport people someplace. And that's the simple. And we had to find places to go. And Fells Point was the place, became the place to go when we started. And I'll tell you what, let's cut right now.